Off you go.
Ready? My name is Patricia Honor Shepeard. I was born on the 12th of May 1930 in Brixton, London, in a place called Ferndale Court, where I understand I was the first baby born there, and was a new buildings for police officers and their families. What now?
Keep going.
What I've got here?
Yeah.
My mother was Lillian Honor. My father, Leonard Charles, he was a City of London police officer, and believed my mother was a seamstress in her youth. My father served in the First World War as a private in the Royal Fusiliers, drafted to France, fought at Ypres, the Somme, Arras and Cambrai, where he was wounded. After treatment in hospital, he rejoined his regiment and served in various engagements. He was demobbed in February 1919 and held a 1934-15 Star and the General Services and Victory Medals. I have one brother, Leonard, 5 years older than me. Yes, in 3 stages really. At home until evacuated to Hook, Chessington in Surrey, with relatives, but at all times well cared for, but was brought up very strictly by an elderly aunt, my father's sister-in-law, but at all times was well cared for. On return to Britain in the last 2 or 3 years of the war, can only remember good times and with no television or any other form of communication other than newspapers, usually blissfully unaware of the rest of the world, except in later years when visiting cinemas was made aware in Pathé News of some of the atrocities around the world. Unaware of any particular interest as a child, although I did enjoy sport, rounders and netball and was good at them all. Unaware of future hostilities, but do remember the actual announcement that England was at war with Germany, which at the time sounded scary, but ignorant of what it all meant. Yes, remember seeing the dogfights overhead in Chessington, which at the time were, of course, very exciting, but unaware really of what was really happening, and fortunately don't recall any shooting down. My brother in the Royal Air Force, unaware of most of his activities, but he ended up in India. An uncle who was in the army stationed in Scotland, who I understood was involved in major building works for which he was later awarded a medal. No, although my father, when off duty, was out frequently with the Home Guard, and I think my brother sometimes accompanied him. At young age, rather took everything in our stride, as did not realise the horrors which were happening to the world. Can't recall thinking about being scared of what might happen. Obviously, when seeing the horrendous bomb damage around did make you realise what could happen. Remember the night in the City of London when it was so badly hit. My father was out on duty and my mother and I were dreadfully worried about his safety. When evacuated, spent most nights in air raid shelter at the bottom of the garden. I slept on a bunk bed. And back home at the earlier stages of the war, when nights were spent in a ground floor flat in the centre of Ferndale Court, which had bricked up and used as an air raid shelter. I don't remember anything but happy times. After hearing the sirens and the bombers going overhead, and then hearing explosions, everyone would look at each other and say, "Wonder who's caught it tonight." After my aunt and uncle's bungalow was destroyed by one of the first doodlebugs, and I was back with my mother and father, apparently the bunk bed I had slept in for many nights was split down the middle. Fortunately, living, so far as I recall, was just a case of having to get on with it. Rationing was, of course, a major problem, but everyone just accepted the situation and continued as best they could, including join the endless queues, and very grateful at the end for what were able to get. Never remember ever being hungry or thirsty. Clothes rationing made life difficult at times, but most women undid jumpers and reknitted them, made undid jumpers and reknitted them, attended jumble sales and remade clothes, turned shirt collars and cuffs, and at times made top coats with blankets. And many women worked in factories doing war work or joined the land army or one of the women's forces. When back in Britain, our flat had my mother's sister.
Britain or Brixton? Britain or Brixton?
Brixton.
You said when back in Britain.
Brixton.
Brixton. Yeah.
Did I say Britain?
Yeah. Brixton.
Apologies.
Don't worry.
When back in Brixton, our flat had my mother's sister and one young son and one of my mother's nieces who worked at the American embassy, living with us, and the latter had an American boyfriend. And as the Americans didn't suffer our rationing, we were fortunate to have small food parcels now and again, including nylon stockings. We often had a house full with friends of my brother in the Navy visiting us when on leave, who bought their ration cards, and so did my brother, so the family was able to cater pretty well, particularly as both my mother and aunt were excellent in the kitchen. Don't honestly remember what meals we had, but always remember them as tasty and sufficient. After the war ended, remember that several of us children used to go down the Ferndale Road and wait by the railway bridge and wave to all the troops returning home. After returning home in the latter years of the war, I went to the Greycoat Hospital School in Westminster, where I had been awarded a special free place. The school had returned from evacuation themselves. During evacuation, I had attended the Tiffin Girls' School in Kingston, which I loved, and was very upset to have to leave to return to Greycoat Hospital, as I had so enjoyed my schooling there and progressed well, and don't think I really ever enjoyed school after that. I don't recall any particularly amusing moments, but a particularly tragic moment occurred when my mother was injured by bomb damage and eventually had to have her right breast removed, which gave her many years of distress. Not sure. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, I've lost it.
No, I think you go there.
No, I've read that.
Oh.
I'm going to turn it off from there.
Hang on.
Not sure if it was by a bomb in Ferndale Court or by a landmine which destroyed an organ factory in Ferndale Road. Probably the worst thing that happened to me, apart from being away from home, was having to restart schooling at Greycoat Hospital, which by comparison was to Tiffin's was archaic. Probably the most fearful thing was the arrival of the doodlebugs, which was scary, for you never knew when they were going to where they were going with their engines stopped. I was also scared when I actually saw a V2 bomb descending, in which devastated parts of Clapham just a few miles from Brixton seconds later. I remember my mother, who was a gentle, mild-tempered lady, actually swearing at the doodlebugs, which in retrospect was quite amusing, but at the time endorsed the situation. At Brixton, But that was asking about VE Day. At Brixton, but whether I was there or with imagination, I seem to remember VE Day celebrations in Buckingham Palace. Thought I was with my brother, but he didn't recall it. Certainly that was a wonderful time, thousands of people everywhere, just deliriously happy, street parties everywhere, and Ferndale Court had a great one in their sports ground. Unfortunately, I have no photographs. And to be honest, don't think about the war only when it's referred to on television. Things I remember. I well remember the blackouts and lack of signposts, all the barrage balloons, sirens, searchlights, ack fire, and the horrendous noise of enemy aircraft overhead night after night, and the sight of the resultant bomb damage. And latterly the noise of the doodlebugs and the deafening silence when their engines stopped. The horrible gas masks, which thankfully we didn't have to use, but had to have them with us at all times. In latter years, when living and working in the city, the bomb damage to streets and after street was still there, so it was many years before the war could really be forgotten. Also, initially, only went to infant school about 3 mornings a week. I remember passing the almshouses next to Ferndale Court with 2 or 3 barrage balloons on the way to school. Remember too that metal gates at Ferndale Court and pretty well everywhere else where appropriate had to be taken down for the war effort, and wherever possible land was taken for Dig for Victory campaign, and gardeners grew vegetables, not flowers. Sweets were a thing of the past, and we never saw fruit like oranges, bananas, etc., nor nuts. It was a good job we didn't know then of everything available now, so we didn't really miss it. We just had to accept it. Remember the games we used to play? Whip and top, rolling wooden hoops with sticks, skipping, hopscotch, tennis bats and balls, where we used to spend hour after hour hitting balls against the many available walls. And the boys used to play a rough game called something like Jump Jimmy Knacker. And I've remembered since that we used to play marbles in the drains and all sorts, and thing called fives, all in the roads. But we didn't worry about dirt in those days. We had scooters and bikes, and we were so fortunate to be able to use them all because at Ferndale Court the roads were so beautifully empty and no cars, and we could just go round to our heart's content. When having returned to Greycoat Hospital, I found the situation very archaic at times, particularly so when we used to do gym or play games. We had to do them in black bathing costumes, and the teachers would see us afterwards and hose us down with the hose pipes, cold water.